Hello, I'm Dhruva Jaishankar, Executive Director of the Observer Research Foundation America. We're approaching the 20th anniversary of the 9/11 attacks, which witnessed the deaths of some 3,000 people in New York, in Washington, D.C., and in Pennsylvania. The repercussions, of course, went far beyond that and changed our conceptions and our vocabulary when it came to notions of national security. One major change was the creation in the United States of the Department of Homeland Security, or DHS, which subsumed several other agencies. To discuss this and the aftermath of 9/11, and particularly its implications for Homeland Security in the United States and elsewhere, it's a great privilege to have Michael Chertoff, Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security, during a pivotal time from 2005 to 2009 during the Bush administration. A lawyer and a judge, he is now head of the Chertoff Group. Thank you, Secretary Chertoff, for joining us.
Happy to be on. Sad occasion.
Mhm. Uh, as you mentioned, many of us were affected quite personally by the events of 9/11 and its aftermath. I think a lot of us, myself included, can remember exactly where we were when we heard or saw the news about the Twin Towers. What are your recollections of 9/11 itself?
On September 11th, I was the head of the criminal division at the U.S. Department of Justice in Washington. And the U.S. Department of Justice in those days had responsibility for dealing with all terrorist incidents. So I was driving into my office and I was on a cell phone or a car phone talking to my deputy. And he said, a plane just hit the World Trade Center. And like many people, I assumed it was some small plane with a pilot who got confused. And we continued to talk, and he had the television on, and then he said a second plane hit. And we both realized this was not an accident. So I got into the office in the Department of Justice a few minutes later, and the two of us walked across the street to the FBI, where they had the command center, which in those days was used to manage all terrorist incidents in the US. And there, Bob Mueller, who was the newly appointed director of the FBI, met me. And we immediately began to review all the evidence to see who had done it. And more important, how did we stop more things from happening? Because as I went into the building, I heard about the Pentagon being hit by a plane. And then as we were meeting, we heard, of course, about the fourth plane having been hijacked. And, relatively quickly that day, due to the courageous decision by a number of the passengers to use their cell phones to call home and report on what they saw, we were able to determine where some of the hijackers were sitting. And from that, we were able to look at the manifest and begin the process of tracking all their connections so that we could see if there was anybody else out there that was going to attack. And within a matter of a day, we knew it was Al Qaeda, we knew it was bin Laden. And then we began days of investigation to pull together a picture of the entire network.
So very much a sort of hands-on from day one experience in your case. Um, you were also involved. I mean, subsequently the establishment of Department of Homeland Security, one of the major administrative changes in the U.S. government after 9/11. What were some of the biggest challenges, as you recall, with the establishment of DHS?
Well, of course, DHS was established in 2003. I became secretary in 2005. And the department was established while, in fact, we were very much engaged in counterterrorist activity. And there were also other threats and challenges that were going on. So someone described it as building an airplane while you're in flight. We didn't have the opportunity to retreat and contemplate all the dimensions of what we had to do. We had to literally put it together as we were engaged in the process of defending the country. The challenge was to take a number of security related agencies that had been housed in other departments and pull them together and bring a unified effort to the entire group. And that takes a little bit of time. There are cultural differences. There are practical differences mechanically in terms of the way the agencies work. We had to build from scratch a central headquarters infrastructure that could manage these things. And we also had to begin the process of developing a culture. So all of these things meant that at the first few years, maturing a department was a very big challenge.
And you know, amongst other things, you had customs, INS, Immigration Nationalization Services, TSA, FEMA. Where do you see sort of the greatest challenges here in terms of amongst these agencies?
Well, the theory was to look at all of the areas that one has to defend in the homeland and to pull them together in a single department. So you have the borders, you have your land borders, your air, and your sea. So we needed Customs and Border Protection. We needed ICE for interior enforcement. We needed what became CIS, Citizenship and Immigration Services, to deal with people who were applying to become citizens. We also needed the Coast Guard. And all those had to be brought together. Likewise, TSA was responsible for aviation security. The Coast Guard had responsibility for maritime security. And TSA also had responsibility for land-based transportation. So again, we brought all those together. And then you had Secret Service and other parts of the department that were focused on critical infrastructure, including what became a very big part of the responsibility, which was cybersecurity. So all of these things had to be synchronized so that the leadership of the department could have a holistic look at where all the threats might be, whether they be air, land, sea, physical, or virtual, and to be able to take a comprehensive approach without having seams or gaps in the total defense posture.
What were some of the major improvements, in your view, to Homeland Security that you oversaw during your tenure?
Well, I think one of the things we had to do is we had to rebuild FEMA because Hurricane Katrina revealed that FEMA was not really fit for an emergency that overwhelmed a state. The original model of FEMA relied upon the idea that state authorities would be the first responders. And what FEMA would do would be to support them with resources, money, and ultimately to come into an afflicted area and help rebuild it by providing money for claims and for the process of reconstruction. But it was not meant to be an operational agency that actually got into the field and did rescues. It relied upon other parts of the federal government, but mainly the state government, to do that. Well, what we discovered with Hurricane Katrina was we had basically a dysfunctional state and city government in New Orleans. And they did not have the ability to respond effectively, and they had never planned for the kind of flooding that they encountered in 2005. So that caused us to rethink FEMA as having some operational capability in reserve in case the state or local government failed. And so rebuilding that was a major part of what we did. And again, in 2008, when we had hurricanes in the Gulf, things worked much better. We had a plan that worked. We were able to evacuate everybody. All the parts of the disaster management mechanism came together. And so we made a lasting improvement by doing that.
This is a Hurricane Rita in Houston, as I recall, right? Was
Correct.
the big one, yeah.
Correct.
So FEMA was one big. I mean, also there wasn't another. I mean, thankfully, another major terrorist attack, at least on the scale of 9/11, that affected the homeland actually subsequently. So
that's correct. We were able to prevent international terrorists from coming into the country, and preventing them from carrying out any kind of attack at scale or even minor attacks. We have
Mhm.
had some terrorist attacks since I left office, but
Mhm.
they tended to be one offs or a couple of people. They were not what we saw on 9/11. And some of that was due to the good work at patrolling the border and securing aviation. We've not had a hijacking since
Mhm.
9/11. And it was also cooperation with the intelligence community, with the Department of Defense, and with our allies around the world.
In hindsight, what were some of the decisions you think could have been made differently? I mean, what were there some, missed opportunities or improvements that, when you look back that you think could have been done better?
I think we were challenged in terms of our ability to deal with and process terrorists who we captured in the battlefield in Afghanistan and elsewhere in the world. Some of them were sent to Guantanamo, some of them were located in third countries. There was a lot of controversy about interrogation, and the mechanism for adjudicating the cases was not really put together efficiently. It's amazing to me that some of the hijackers who are still in custody in Guantanamo have still not been tried.
Mhm.
The trials have been dragging on. There have been all kinds of delays and motions. It's almost 20 years. So
Mhm.
I think that there was perhaps too little attention paid to building a legal architecture that would allow us to adjudicate and resolve those cases.
It was, in your view, was that due more to, was it political reasons? Was it differences with, say, the CIA, the foreign and domestic intelligence agencies that operate under very different circumstances? What were the key reasons?
I think you had a lot, different perspectives. The Justice Department had a perspective. The Department of Defense, which really controlled Guantanamo, had a perspective. The intelligence agencies had a perspective. And of course, as I said earlier, we were building the airplane while we flew it.
Mhm.
So I think that caused some delay in resolving what the legal architecture should be. And then, frankly, I think people got distracted by other things, and they assumed as long as people are sitting in Guantanamo and they're not going anywhere and they're not carrying out more attacks, there's no rush to adjudicate. But the reality is, good order suggests that we should get these cases resolved one way or the other so justice is done.
18 years on from the formation of DHS, do you think the airplane has been built? Is it still a work in progress?
Well,
How do
I
you?
mean, the challenge is that the airplane is always flying through different weather.
Mhm.
So many of the things we tried to do did get done, but there are new challenges. And cybersecurity is one, for example, that the department has become much more heavily focused on. Now, with the new administration, I think there's going to be a real push to integrate what DHS does on cybersecurity with what's done by the intelligence community and the private sector. And so I think that's another area that we're going to see some significant improvement. But we're also seeing domestic terrorism as an emerging major threat. And that involves all kinds of complicated legal issues about how you monitor that. And that's going to be the next challenge in upgrading the airplane.
Mhm. So I was actually going to get to the cyber, because we're at a time when um, cyber attacks seem to be, every week almost. We have a sort of a news reports of major cyber attacks, whether it's in the United States or elsewhere, affecting U.S. interests. Um, is that one area you think is deserving of greater investment going forward?
No question, cyber attacks are now probably the number one threat to Homeland Security. It's a threat also in the military dimension as well.
Mhm.
And it's moved from simply being criminals, although the criminals are still out there, to being a tool used by nation states and terrorists to carry out attacks. And it's moved from theft of money and theft of intellectual property into actually affecting operating systems that deal with our healthcare, our transportation, our fuel, and our food. So it's easy to see that we're now looking at a potential series of attacks that could cause not only significant property damage, but loss of life.
So, are there other issues that you think are going to be a bit after cyber that you see as sort of you mentioned domestic terrorism. What is the nature you think of that changing? How is that different from the counterterrorism issues you had to tackle in the decade after 9/11?
Well, in the decade after 9/11, we were dealing with international
Hmm.
terrorists.
Hmm.
They were headquartered largely overseas. That meant they had to get to the US to carry out attacks, and we built a mechanism to make that very difficult for them to do. It also meant our ability to use intelligence tools and even military tools overseas was a real asset because you could collect intelligence and you could even use force to eliminate threats in other parts of the world. Because of the law, those avenues are not available in the US. You can't just bomb people in the US. And even the ability to collect intelligence in the US is very constrained by legal rules and our American Constitution, like the First Amendment. So the question is, how do you build a mechanism to alert you to potential domestic terrorism while adhering to the rule of law that is fundamental? And I think we're still wrestling with that. But more and more, what we've seen is extremists, particularly right wing extremists in the US, and some of them also have connections overseas, are becoming more and more bold in carrying out physical attacks. And of course, I have to say, the number one proof of this is January 6th, when we had literally an attempt to have an insurrection and overthrow a democratic election by, among other things, a significant group of extremist individuals. And of course, this was encouraged and incited by the disappointed outgoing president, Donald Trump. So this is going to be a problem with us for a while. And I think we're going to have to retool our collection and our response capabilities to operate within a domestic environment without compromising the rule of law and our freedom.
Well, thank you for this so enriching and wide-ranging discussion. And while it is a sober occasion to look back on 20 years after 9/11.
Let me add two other things to watch.
Mm-hmm.
One is, as we've learned from the pandemic, the idea of a nation scale or global scale medical emergency is now going to be much more in the forefront of our mind. And climate change. We've seen an increase in wildfires and hurricanes, and that means that DHS and other agencies are going to have to be prepared to respond. So there's going to be a very full plate of things to do.
So both the further transnational threats of a different nature, but also domestic challenges of a different nature.
Exactly. And this will require global cooperation.
Thank you again for taking the time for this discussion. It's been really enriching and really wide-ranging. And thank you so much for your time and bringing your wealth of expertise to this conversation. Although it is obviously a sobering occasion, being 20 years after the 9/11 attacks. But thank you again, Secretary Chertoff, and I look forward to further discussions with you on behalf of ORF America.
Thank you. Be well.